for about a year and a half now. I arrived in October of 2010, and I thought I was arriving post-quake, but those expectations got shaken up. Huh? Yeah, all right. We'll keep moving along. Anyway, it resulted in a really interesting experience for our organization. We really had to be flexible, and we got a lot of learning out of what we've been through. So we had a lot of expectations following September, and some of those prepared us for what was to come. And in other cases, we found that all bets were off, and that we had a lot to adapt to. What I hope that you'll get out of this presentation is that I can inform some expectations for what might take place in your sector if there's a natural disaster. But I'd also like you to think about your day-to-day expectations of your work and what might happen if you were able to step outside of them. To go through a quick outline, I'm going to introduce a couple of New Zealand terms, because I know not everyone's from New Zealand. I'm going to talk about disaster literature, the media, and clinical expectations, how those influenced us. I'll talk about post-earthquake data, which helped inform our expectations and sometimes turn them upside down a little bit, qualitative and quantitative. And I'll also talk about the way that our public health work was transformed and that we saw our sector change as a result of the earthquakes as well. So first of all, if you missed out on the 2 minutes of silence and you just picked this presentation for the catchy title, we've had some earthquakes in Christchurch, and they've been pretty influential for us. They've been neat, actually. So there was a big earthquake in September. The earthquake that we pretty much agree was the largest was the one in February, which resulted in fatalities and a decimated CBD. But there were also serious earthquakes in June of 2011 and December of 2011, kind of into January 2012, plus about 10,000 aftershocks, as Ron said. So we've had a lot to reckon with. You're going to hear me talk several times in the presentation about pokies. If you haven't heard of those before, those are like slot machines. They are slot machines. And so when I talk about pokey venues, those are places that have pokey machines like pubs and clubs. So after the earthquakes began, our organization needed to get information so we could know what to expect clinically. And because we're seen as an expert in our field, and if people approached us wanting to know what to expect, we needed to be able to give informed responses. So the PGF librarian and I looked at some research to try to gain some insight. There's actually very little academic, peer-reviewed evidence that relates directly to problem gambling and post-disaster, specifically post-natural disaster. A lot of the evidence we found came out of the United States, and again, not all the disasters that were researched were natural disasters, but we felt it was applicable. It was applicable enough, particularly when the research talked about addiction and abuse. We know that natural disasters or other disasters can be a source of stress, trauma, and displacement, and that these things can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, and general distress. And all of these things make for a community that's more vulnerable, which is a concern for us. These things can also result in an increase in substance abuse, addiction, and mood disorders. Hurricane Katrina also, research around that looked at displacement, which was a very relevant factor in Christchurch. It's related to high levels of medical and mental health problems. And these things don't always appear right away. It can be 6 months after an event or after a series of events in our case. Amongst all this, we needed to figure out exactly what was going on in our community. So we've talked a little bit about the clients. We've talked a little bit about the media, but what we do really well as an NGO is knowing our community. So we got out on the ground, and we decided to follow up client anecdotes, media stories, investigating via a pub crawl for research. We visited 15 different pokey venues across Christchurch in several different neighborhoods that were affected. And we're able to get we were able to find out a lot of really interesting stuff. Basically, we were able to distribute some promotional material. We were able to do some observation. We were able to feel really informed, but we were able to gain some pretty valuable insight from the conversations that we had. The conversations that we had indicated very clearly that there had been an increase in gambling in pubs. Some of the pub staff attributed that to displacement from other venues, but across the board, I mean, pretty much, folks saw heavy or moderate increases in gambling in their venue, and that's definitely a cause of concern for us. Being there also offered an opportunity for intervention, and I don't mean an intervention in that we were able to collect clients. I'm not sure that we're actually allowed to do things like that, but we were able to correct some misconceptions that existed at the venues. A few misperceptions that we were able to correct on the spot are listed right up here. These are relative quotes from staff members that we talked to. One gentleman, when we asked him about whether or not there had been an increase in problem gambling at this venue, assured us that there were no more Asian people there than there were before the earthquake. So clearly there wasn't a problem. And so we had to talk to this guy about race and how problem gambling can affect any race. Someone else at another venue said that the jackpots are so small, they don't really worry about problem gambling anyway. Well, yikes, we need to talk about problem gambling then, because small jackpots and big jackpots don't necessarily make that big of a difference. And someone else told us almost gleefully that there was a lot more traffic, but it was the cream of the crop, not the assholes. And we needed to remind that person that host responsibility applies to both. So we were getting this picture together sort of chronologically as we went. We stopped and we did this investigation. And one of the things that it helped us to do was to make sense of expenditure data that was coming out of the DIA. And when you look at this graph up here, I mean, wow. Can I just point? Do I even need to say anything? Like, there's a really surprising spike there. Unfortunately, when we were at this point in time, the spike really, we didn't really know what was coming. We had to rely heavily on qualitative data in order to explain what we thought was happening. Even when we got to this point, the industry was telling us that the casino was closed during part of that time. So actually folks had just left the casino and were gambling more in public for that reason. We disagreed, and we were able to disagree fairly authoritatively because we had been in the community and seen what was happening. It also helped later that the DIA broke down figures month by month and was able to say, oh, actually, even when the casino reopened, spending was still. But we've got some great strength in what we've already done. I'd like to go back to the pub visits for just a moment, because one of the great advantages of our sector, again, is that we know our community. We actually know our community better than the industry does. So we were at a council hearing, and there was a pub trying to say, or a pokey trust trying to say, oh no, we've talked to someone who talked to someone who talked to this other guy, and we're pretty sure that there hasn't been an increase in gambling at that venue. But we were able to say, actually, we were at that venue, and they said that there had been an increase in problem gambling behavior. And I didn't bring up that that person also told me that they'd had to hire more staff to accommodate the increase in gambling behavior, because I didn't want to get anyone into trouble. But boy, that sure did a lot for our credibility. And even in the wake of disaster, like, if you know your strength, you have to play to it, and that was absolutely one of our strengths. When the earthquakes began, weren't completely optimistic, but they weren't completely pessimistic either. And our experiences haven't been totally positive, but they haven't been totally negative either. So we're on this really fine line of opportunity, and that's not really such a bad place to be. There's a disaster researcher named Rebecca Solnit. In her book, Paradise Built in Hell, she says that many now do not even hope for a better society, but they know it when they encounter it, and they discover that. And that discovery shines out even through the namelessness of their experience. Others recognize it, grasp it, make something of it, and long-term social and political transformations, both good and bad, arise for the wreckage. I think right now in Christchurch, everyone wants to see the good arise from the wreckage. And actually, in some ways, we're free from some of the expectations and obligations that constrained our perspective. And we're now free to consider living and acting in another way. So we're prepared to take the necessary steps for that good transformation.